Are you already registered at Wikisana?
Welcome, dear viewers, to our format, The Meaning of Life. Today it is about learning and how we can make it more efficient, yes, much easier. I am allowed to talk to Josua Kohberg about this. He is a neuroscientist. He has been researching and developing in this area for over 26 years. And what he has to tell us is really fascinating. Stay tuned. Hello, dear Joshua. I'm glad you're here again, because the first episode also completely fascinated me. Because there are so many possibilities in it. It's about brain tuning, and today we're talking about learning.
Absolutely. As you said, I'm not a teacher or a linguist. We deal a lot with language courses. I actually only look at how the brain processes information. And then you realize relatively quickly that our, let's call it classical learning methods, are sometimes very counterproductive to what our brain actually needs to learn.
Yes, you can also see in schools how many children really suffer. And then you really have to ask yourself, is this system time appropriate, children appropriate, human friendly? And I'm really curious what that means. So is it mainly about learning a language or in general? Can you learn anything, or what have you developed there?
In fact, it's really about every learning content. Although I have to say that I have specialized in the topic of auditory learning, i.e. comprehend audio content, and in turn very strongly in the language area. That's a bit of my history. I started to deal with the whole topic of learning because I got to know Vera F. Birkenby in 1995. And that's how this whole topic of languages, which was also very strong here, came into my life. But basically I deal with learning in general. Also through the study that I then completed, because the question for me was always, why do we find it incredibly difficult in certain areas of our lives, and in other areas we don't even realize that we are acquiring a new skill, for example.
But a lot of it also has to do with the area of interest, that you learn quickly. But is it basically also possible to make improvements in areas that we really don't like to learn, or that we can't do so well, or that we don't like so much?
Basically, yes. But in the first step, if it's not necessarily necessary to have the knowledge or to have this ability, I would actually advise against it at first. If I say I don't feel drawn to it, then the first step for me would be to see how is actually with my personality structure. We have developed an analysis of the voice, where you can find out very quickly how I am actually characterized. Am I more creative? Am I more structured? Are my interests more in the social area? Are they more in abstract areas? And if I go there now and say I'm actually a very socially oriented person, and at some point someone told me, I don't know, my parents, that if my father was a programmer, that programming would guarantee a very secure job, then as a socially creative person, I would actually always act against myself. So that doesn't mean that the person can't learn to program. I don't mean that, but she would never really become happy, and thus she would never really get to an absolute highest performance in the area.
Yes, and above all, the quality of life was probably not the same, right? And then, for example, if someone comes to you and says, I really have a problem, I have to learn this from a business point of view, would you advise them to do a voice analysis first to see where the skills of the person really are?
Exactly. So that's the first thing we always recommend. Although you have to say that we have also developed a language training concept, which is also completely independent of that. So every person can learn a language, that's not the question. But it just goes a lot faster, a lot more intensively if I know what my orientation is, how do I learn as a person? So what is my character and how do I learn? But in fact, if you break down learning even further, then you realize that there are actually only two methods with which we learn. Either a high rate of repetition or, on the other hand, a high level of emotion. Or, ideally, both together. So if I look at a little boy, for example, who likes to play football, then he has a high level of emotion and he always plays when he has time. Because he can meet with his friends, that has a social component. And such a child may then play a few hundred, a few thousand hours and gets better and better, but does not realize that he is learning. That's actually the deciding factor.
That's really exciting. And what does that mean with the repetitions? You have developed an app or a watch, or what is that?
Exactly.
And then you wear that on your skin and it emits signals. Or do you have to make an active contribution? Because I'm really not that, how should I say, technologically advanced. Can you explain that to someone who is not so good at it, how it works?
I would say we take an example out. I would take the example of learning languages. Because, as I said, it is also one of my main expertises. But of course I can also explain it best with one example. We usually experience language learning from school. That means we enter the school and should then, for example, learn English. Or French or Latin, whatever comes there. And our connection with language learning begins there. In fact, we actually learn a language much earlier, namely our native language. And the example of the native language can be explained perfectly in terms of learning according to the brain. And it is so that a child, that is, the procreation takes place. And from the 16th week of pregnancy, our hearing has already been trained. So that means we can already hear the mother in the uterus from the 16th, 17th week. And now we don't have anything here that we would associate with learning languages, but we just have a melody. So we hear and hear and hear. And exactly the same thing happens after birth. So we come to the world, then we hear the father in addition to the mother, other people around us. And this process takes about a year again. So we hear and we hear and we hear with an extremely high rate of repetition. And only when we have developed this feeling for the language, so when we take this language melody with us, by the way, with all the dialects. So when a child grows up here in Switzerland, then of course it has a different pronunciation than a child who grows up in Cologne or in Munich or in Doctor's Den. And the interesting thing about it is that by experiencing the language melody, I get a feeling for the language. And that actually has no place in classical language learning. In classical language learning, someone comes and says, so here I would have a grammar rule and here I would have words that you should please learn by heart. That makes no sense for our brain at all, because we don't recognize a why behind it either. So the why that I say I need a good grade in school, that's not a driving factor. With mother tongue, on the other hand, the why is completely clear. I want to interact. There are these people who smile at me, who solve my problems. And I also notice that they somehow communicate. So it would be nice if I could also communicate with them. And then of course they are also enthusiastic language coaches. That means, when the child says mama for the first time at the age of 11 months, then the mother flips out. Then she calls her own mother and says, yes, now she said mama for the first time. If you compare that with the statement of the English teacher in the 5th grade, then you already know where the emotion is.
Yes, absolutely.
That would be the first insight. We have to hear something over and over again, so that we can reproduce it at all. And reproducing also has nothing to do with grammar rules, but it's a copy-paste effect. So that means I record it and simply copy it. That's why I copy Swiss German, or I copy Bavarian, or I copy Saxon. That doesn't matter at all. I just copy what is spoken to me. And then I suddenly start to link pictures. That means, at some point I understand, this face that always shines on me, that has an audio code, mama. Or this square box with 4 wheels, that has the audio code car. So at some point I understand that they always say car. And I have a picture. And now, as a German native speaker, I see a square box with 4 wheels and think car. But I could also think car. Or if I were Italian, I could think China. If I were Spanish, I could think kosh. So it doesn't really matter what kind of audio code I attach to it. And that's how a worldview is created. And what we do, we have broken down this entire learning concept into permanent listening. So listen and listen and listen. Now most people can't travel abroad. That's why we solved it with a small technical device. It's called NEOS. I have it in my hand. I get ultrasonic frequencies combined with audio on the skin. I don't have it right now, but it could be a Spanish course, for example. And then I hear and hear and hear Spanish. Like a native speaker who grows up in the native language. Or an exchange student who lives with the Spanish family. And through this listening and listening and listening, I have a language melody that is anchored on my conscious and unconscious level. And now all I have to do is understand the language. And that's what we do according to the Birkenby method that I was allowed to learn from her. We translate word for word. That means no grammar rules, no words learned by heart, but only contextual learning. That means there's a sentence. Let's take an English example. Most listeners or viewers probably know it. Let's take an example. How do you do? Now I have it in English class. Now I learn how do you do. Now it is very abstract. I don't even know what the words mean. And with us, you get these words translated one-to-one with "Why hast du tan?" How do you do? And then I can suddenly understand the words and automatically get the grammar. And when people ask me, but don't I need the grammar to learn a language? Then I say, I can't do German grammar either. But I wrote 9 books. I published 16 language courses without knowing grammar. Of course, from school, I have a great proofreader. She knows grammar and she reads my books.
So there are a lot of things that I find very fascinating. But first the question, if I now have the learning program on my skin, is it acoustically audible?
Exactly. So actually it would be if you drive the sound pressure far enough down. So if I use it here in normal everyday life, I don't hear anything at all. We talk and I can learn Spanish in the meanwhile. I can drive a car. I can sleep. I can sit at the computer. I can advise my customers. I can practically activate my speech center 24 hours a day without conscious sound pressure.
And how is that? Now simply a critical question, because often we are with the many things that we do next to each other, with the multitasking, we can't focus. How is it when I am talking to you, for example? And I also have the language program. Isn't that a bit stressful exactly?
So there is a very important difference. Neuroscience is not necessarily consciousness research, but of course we also scratch along with it. And I now go a little more into the topic of consciousness research. We know that we have conscious, unconscious, and preconscious levels. And multitasking, stress always arises only on the conscious level. So that means I try to drive a car, to make a phone call, and then look at my cell phone, and then I have an accident because I try to do 3 things at the same time. What we have here with NEOS, or with this passive hearing about the skin, we address the preconscious level. That means I have a processing speed here that is gigantic, because I don't even consciously process it with my senses. For example, I drove here for just over 5 hours today. If I were now susceptible to hypnosis and I had a good hypnotist, then he could now put me into hypnosis and I could say exactly how many white lines were on the entire route here, on the highway and so on. This information is completely irrelevant, but I perceive them pre-consciously. So it doesn't matter how many lines there are, I have perceived them. I just haven't processed them. What's the point? It's not relevant. What I have processed is that I, for example, phoned my wife. I had a short phone call with the office. I still know that. So that would be conscious processing. And a language or any learning content that we really master. So if I really master, then it is not only consciously learned, but it has been deposited on the unconscious and preconscious level, and this happens through repetition rate.
That's really exciting and a very important answer, because I always thought that when you use these technical devices, then you get this sensory overload and this overwhelming demand. But now I have really understood it well, and it is very exciting that these 2 things take place on different levels. Normally, when this program is running, then I do not hear anything acoustically and it just goes to the preconscious, unconscious level. And can I just retrieve it after a certain amount of time, or do I have to deal with the learning content in a different way?
Absolutely. So just because I hear a language over and over again, I do not yet have a language competence. You have to be very clear about that. I would like to capture it in a picture because the conscious level, if you would describe it with speed and length, then the consciousness would have a length of 15 millimeters and would move like a walker against the unconsciousness with 11 kilometers, with the speed of a jet, so double the speed of sound.
Und die vorbewussten, unbewussten Ebenen hätten eine Länge von 11 Kilometer, also gegen 15 Millimeter, und arbeiten wie ein Düsenjet, also doppelte Schallgeschwindigkeit.
That means extremely fast, extremely intense, but not consciously processed.
Aber eben nicht bewusst verarbeitet.
If I now, for example, master something like a language, then it is anchored on this preconscious level, as we are now talking.
So wie wir uns jetzt unterhalten.
We did not say anything, we have an interview, I do not recite anything here. You do not ask questions you read beforehand, but we use exactly the moment when we want to express something and bring the knowledge of the language to the conscious level.
Ausdrücken wollen und holen das Wissen von der Sprache nach oben, auf die bewusste Ebene.
That is actually the kick when learning. When I bring something to these unconscious, subconscious levels, then I can pull it up very quickly and I do it in hours. If I learn a language today and say I want to be able to converse in Spanish or Italian on vacation, then that's an advanced beginner's level. For this I usually go to school for 4 to 5 years. Why? Because I try to press grammar rules above the 15 millimeters, to learn words by heart, and then individual drops always plop down on my unconscious levels. The problem is also if I always do this on Fridays, the Spanish lesson, then I have forgotten everything again by next Friday because my brain needs a lot of energy, and if our brain notices that this is not really relevant knowledge, then it is pushed aside immediately. That means we do not use any energy for it. What we do, we take the language melody and shoot it 8 to 9 hours to this subconscious level, simply by hearing it over the skin. This is not yet a language competence, but I have the language melody sitting down there, as if I were a baby on the conscious level, but then we do the following, we briefly pull the information up to the conscious level, but after it is already anchored down there, the information up there immediately gets stuck. So if I read Hasta la vista in a Spanish course, then I would link it with until the view. I had the story as a picture before. I know they are just saying goodbye, and now I understand. They do not say goodbye, but they say until the view. And with that I have an extremely fast link from the context with the anchored speech melody. Now I don't need 5 to 6 years. It takes me 3 months, and in the 3 months I have 8 to 9 hours on the skin, the language 500 to 600 hours, but I can work, drive, sleep, what I want, so it does not bother me at all. And 2 to 3 times a day I consciously learn for 8 minutes. So I just link the language on the conscious level. I am there with 35 to 40 hours, where otherwise I would be with 300 hours language lessons. And the big difference is I can speak, which usually doesn't really happen in lessons.
But that's just phenomenal. If you tell me that now, then I think the world is revolutionizing, or at least the school system should revolutionize. Because I think that is so important, what you have told me, that we help so many children and people and young people. Are schools open for that, or teachers? How do you experience that?
Very split. I can gladly share my experience. Until 3 years ago I held lectures on schools voluntarily, but that was my idea. I want to give something back to society. And that unfortunately failed fulminantly. This means that these lectures have been accepted, I am allowed to present there, I have distributed learning strategies and books free of charge so that the students can adapt to learn in a more brain-friendly way, and in fact the result is almost zero. The background is simple. I did it for 4 years until I understood that I am running against a system that does not want to change.
Bestandssystem anrenne, das sich gar nicht verändern möchte.
Because the teachers that we have are often under so much stress and have tasks that normally don't even belong to them.
Die haben Aufgaben, die eigentlich gar nicht zu ihnen als Lehrkörper gehören.
They have to take care of the dilapidated hall. They have to fight with their parents that think that the teacher should take over the education. It is a huge problem. And one of the reasons that I stopped was that I realized that this is not efficient. I do not get an impact. I'm going there. I give a presentation in front of 500 to 600 students and parents, and the result is almost zero. I then thought for a long time about how we could change it, and I have an image in my head. We are currently working on a further change of our language training. It will be that we let the whole thing through a kind of game where the game is so interesting that I do not even notice that I am learning Spanish. The picture I have in my head is that a 12-year-old, 13-year-old boy or girl goes to school, played for 3 months with that game, and then tells the teacher, I'm done with English. I speak better than you because many Germans who teach English never have a clean pronunciation because they never recorded the melody permanently. And I think from the bottom up the system can be revolutionized with a clear result. We now have around 40,000 customers. It has to be said clearly that these are mainly adults.
Wir haben in der Zwischenzeit etwa 40.000 Kunden, das sind hauptsächlich Erwachsene, muss man ganz klar dazu sagen, weil unsere Systeme...
Because our systems also cost something. We cannot yet make them free of charge. It is simply because we are a small family business. We have 19 employees. This is of course also expensive. That's why we have products that are worth their price. But in the next few years we will work on at least the language learning in the school area without public promotion. And this will happen when children learn with a high level of fun without realizing that they are learning.
Wonderful view, and wonderfully said. Because this is really a matter of heart for me when I see how many children suffer in the school system and how curious they are when everything comes together. And the teachers give their best. But in a system that is not focused on how we really work and how the joy and curiosity can be received. This is a wonderful work you are doing. And I'm looking forward to learning more about other areas of life. Really great. Was nice having you, Josua. Dear viewers also. Thank you very much for being here. I'm really touched, and I still have a lot of thoughts in my head about how to pass on this knowledge to people and how much pressure and suffering could be saved. And maybe you can try it for yourself or take something out of it. Stay healthy. Goodbye.